This is the video for Chapter 32, Digestion and Nutrition. Although we have already covered most of this material in class, I wanted to make a video that covered the entire PowerPoint at once. So here goes. The first concept on this PowerPoint is that animals are heterotrophs. And so basically the idea behind a heterotroph is that it is an organism that consumes food to obtain both carbon and energy. And so the meaning of this word heterotroph basically is troph, to eat or to feed, and hetero meaning different. So this is an organism that feeds on a different organism to obtain carbon and energy. This is as opposed to an autotroph, which builds its own organic molecules. So if troph means to eat or to feed, and auto means self, then an autotroph literally self-feeds. So that's the difference between basically plants and animals. Plants carry out photosynthesis to self-feed, whereas animals have to ingest other animals or plants in order to obtain their energy source. So the basic reason why animals eat is something that you probably already know, which is that the nutrients are used in order to fuel cellular respiration and to build tissues. So the size of an animal actually plays a role in how much they eat. As it turns out, small animals have more surface area compared to their volume than larger animals. And the extent of this surface area actually means that they're going to lose heat faster. The way that they counter this is to have high metabolic rates in order to help maintain temperature homeostasis. In other words, they have higher metabolic rates to offset the amount of heat that they lose. And because of this, small animals have to eat more food relative to their body size than large animals do. So there are things that can affect how much an organism needs to eat. Its physiological state can affect its metabolic rate. So organisms that are undergoing growth or perhaps repair after an injury, or maybe recovering from some sort of illness, are going to require more energy than adults. So anything that increases the metabolic rate is going to increase the need for energy. So there are different strategies for eating with different animals. Herbivores like the panda that's shown are going to eat only plants. Carnivores like the leopard that is shown are going to eat just other animals. Okay, now when you take a look at these other two organisms, mosquitoes and sharks, if a mosquito is feeding on blood as the female of the species do, technically I would call that carnivory because it is eating a part of another animal. With a shark, even though the animals that it ingests are really small and it's almost a filter feeder, it is still taking in like very small shrimp, so basically zooplankton. Okay, so what you're seeing here are one herbivore and, I think in a technical sense, 3 carnivores. A third strategy is detritivores. These consume decomposing organic matter. A good example of this would be crawdads. I think somebody mentioned in class catfish. I think catfish are probably more omnivores because they will eat other fish if they can catch them. But something like a lobster or crayfish and some crabs that only consume decomposing organic matter are going to be called detritivores. Omnivores are going to eat a broad variety of foods. We're omnivores, and another good example of that would be pigs. Another difference in how animals acquire food is the basic form that they take in. So bulk feeders will take in large chunks of food. Humans, pandas, and leopards. Pandas and leopards being pictured here. Fluid feeders will drink their food. Mosquitoes are an example. Blood is not the only example of this, of course. There are plenty of insects and some birds that actually feed on nectar. So that would be another good example of a fluid feeder. Suspension feeders strain particles from the water And although the text says like this shark, I'm not sure that I would really agree with this shark as a suspension feeder, because I think that the shark is going to strain smaller organisms from the water, but not necessarily be a suspension feeder. What I would think would be more like a suspension feeder would be a sponge, or perhaps a mollusk like a sand dollar that eats very small particles that they strain from the water. Okay, so another way that you can tell an animal's sort of eating habits are by taking a look at the structure of the digestive system. One of the things that I said at the beginning of the semester was that structure and function are often very closely related, and this is a good example of structure and function being related. So what you see here is the digestive tract for a ruminant herbivore, and we'll take another look at this in just a minute, and we'll see the differences between this animal's digestive system and a carnivore's digestive system. In either case, though, although the digestive systems can look very different, there is a 4-stage process of obtaining food and using it, and it is the same between all animals. The first stage is ingestion, which is the entry of food into the digestive tract, and in humans, that location is the mouth. The second stage is digestion, which is the physical and chemical breakdown of food. Now, this is where most of the rest of the digestive system is actually involved. So you're going to see both mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical, also known as physical digestion, means that the food is physically broken into smaller particles. So chewing is a good example of this, and the stomach churning is another good example of this. So you're not changing the food chemically. What you're doing is breaking it into smaller pieces. And the benefit of breaking it into smaller pieces is so that you can carry out chemical digestion more efficiently. So if digestive enzymes are working on really large chunks of food, they'll only be able to work on the outside of that particular chunk of food. Whereas if you break it into much smaller pieces, then the digestive enzyme can attack a lot more of the food at the same time. So mechanical and chemical digestion are very closely intertwined in terms of their function. Stage 3 is absorption. Now, this is going to occur when nutrients enter the cells lining the digestive tract and it moves into the bloodstream. So a couple of things here. First of all, you've got to have cells that are able to absorb these nutrients. And secondly, you've got to have a large network of blood vessels that are closely associated with these cells. It's not going to do much good to absorb the nutrients if there's not distribution of those nutrients around the body. So you're going to see both cells lining the digestive tract and a really extensive portion of the circulatory system surrounding these digestive organs. So this is stage 3, which is absorption. In stage 4, elimination expels undigested food from the body. So our digestive systems are not 100% efficient. So there are always going to be some portions of what you eat that are not digested, and there may be portions of you eat that in fact cannot be digested. A good example of the latter would be if you eat something that's got a lot of dietary fiber in it. Let's say that you have a stalk of celery. So you're going to be able to digest, both mechanically and chemically digest some of that celery, but a lot of the cellulose that's within that celery, which is basically another name for the fiber, a lot of the cellulose that's in that celery actually cannot be digested by your body and has to be passed on out. Okay, so there's a major distinction that needs to be made here, and this is intracellular versus extracellular digestion. So most of what we're familiar with in terms of digestive systems involve extracellular digestion. So whether you're talking about herbivory, carnivory, detritivores, most of what you see is extracellular digestion in animals. So basically, with extracellular digestion, this is digestion that occurs outside of cells. And so any organism that has some sort of compartment or tract or digestive tract leading through it, there's going to be a cavity and cells that line that cavity. So what you'll see is digestion occurring within that cavity or within that tract. You'll see what food has been taken in broken all the way down as far as it can be broken down, and only then is it absorbed into cells. Now, with intracellular digestion, the individual cells can take in fairly good-sized particles relative to the size of the cells, but it's not digested. The food is not digested outside of the cells. It has to be taken into the cells before digestion actually occurs. And so this is pretty much exclusive to sponges, intracellular digestion, whereas extracellular digestion involves every other type of animal. Okay, of those animals that carry out extracellular digestion, there are two basic architectural themes: incomplete digestive tracts and complete digestive tracts. An animal that has an incomplete digestive tract, it only has one opening. So basically, food goes into that opening and wastes come out of that same opening. In a complete digestive tract, there are two openings, a mouth and an anus. And of course, the mouth is the entry point and the anus is the exit point. An incomplete digestive tract also gets called a gastrovascular cavity because not only does it digest food, but it is also going to be responsible for distributing nutrients to cells. So if we take a look at that phrase, or at the term gastrovascular, gastro refers to stomach, which is pretty much going to refer to the digestive portion of this. Vascular refers to the circulatory system. So a gastrovascular cavity is going to be a cavity that is able to digest and absorb nutrients, but also has an extensive network of blood vessels associated with it that can distribute those nutrients to cells. A complete digestive tract is also called an alimentary canal or a gastrointestinal tract. That's usually shortened to GI tract. That's what most people use, frankly, because it's a lot easier to say than gastrointestinal or alimentary. So the structure of this digestive tract depends on the animal's diet, and this is something that I made reference to a little bit earlier. So if you take a look at the digestive system that's on the right, it shows the digestive system of a ruminant. And this is basically an animal that does a lot of grazing, definitely an herbivore. So ruminants have specialized organs, the rumen, after which ruminants are named, and the cecum. These help digest plant matter. Plant matter is very difficult to digest because the sugar, the polysaccharide that makes up plant cell walls, which is called cellulose, it's very difficult for enzymes to attack, and there are actually only a few species of bacteria that can actually pull this trick off. Of course, ruminants have those particular species of bacteria present in their system, but even when those bacteria are present, cellulose is still very difficult to break down. So the adaptations that you have for eating plants consist of usually a multi-chambered stomach, which you can see here on the right, and a small intestine that is relatively long. And so the reason why the small intestine is going to be long is it basically gives more time for the food to be broken down as it passes through the small intestine. You'll also notice that there's a structure pointed out called the cecum, and this is a larger chamber that also assists with plant matter breakdown, with digestion. In this slide, you see a carnivore digestive system, and the first thing to note is that carnivores don't have rumens, so they've got a one-chambered stomach. It's pretty simple. And the second thing to notice is that the cecum is really reduced. I also want to point out that the small intestine is a great deal shorter. And the reason why is because protein is much easier to digest than cellulose is. And this basically means that the animal doesn't need nearly as extensive a digestive system, nor does it need some of the additional structures that herbivores have. So this diagram shows an overview of human digestive system anatomy. We're going to be taking a look at each of these different structures as we go on through the PowerPoint, so I'm not going to go through this entire thing. So as we see this in slides, we'll be covering all of this information. So the first concept that I want you to see in terms of the digestive tract itself, the human digestive tract, is what actually moves food through it. And so this is a process that's called peristalsis, which is waves of muscle contraction. So the slide says that smooth muscles underlie the organs throughout the digestive system. I think maybe a better way of putting it is to say that smooth muscle is in the walls of the organs that make up the digestive tract. So these hollow tubular organs, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestines, the walls of these are actually composed of smooth muscle. And so with most of the GI tract, you actually have two layers of smooth muscle. One layer sort of encircles or is sort of in rings across the width of the tubes, and the other is a longitudinal layer that actually runs along the length of the tube. So basically, when the longitudinal layer contracts, it shortens the tube. And when the circular layer contracts, it actually squeezes the tube. And so this combination of shortening and squeezing actually helps move materials through the different portions of the digestive tract. Now, there is one thing that I want to add to this, and it's that peristalsis is not a process that is limited to the digestive system. It's also present in tubes in both the urinary and the reproductive systems. Okay, so digestion begins in the mouth, and both chemical and mechanical digestion begin in the mouth. The chemical digestion begins when enzymes in the saliva start to digest starch. So this is a carbohydrate, and so there's carbohydrate chemical digestion in the mouth, but no chemical digestion of either protein or of lipids. So at this point, the only thing that is being chemically changed is starches. Now, if you take a look at the teeth here, the different shapes of teeth have got different functions. Incisors are for cutting, canines for tearing, premolars and molars for chewing. And so these different functions, the cutting and the tearing, are basically for meat, and the crushing and grinding are for both for meat and for any sort of plant matter that you take in. So, of course, fruits or vegetables. So this sort of mix of teeth that you would find in a carnivore and teeth that you would find in an herbivore are a clear indication that we are omnivores. And so other omnivores will have the same basic setup. You'll see both premolars and molars. You'll also see incisors and canines, maybe not in the same numbers, but you will see a fairly similar setup. In carnivores, the majority of the teeth have to do with cutting and tearing. So you don't see dogs or cats doing a lot of chewing. Most of the time what they'll do is they'll tear the food off into chunks and sort of swallow it whole. With herbivores, if you've ever seen, say, a cow chewing its cud, or if you've ever seen a horse pulling at grass, in that case the incisors are actually going to be blunt. They're going to be a whole lot more blunt, and they'll be there for grasping and pulling leaves, grasping and pulling grass. And the molars are going to be a lot bigger in proportion to the mouth, and because there's going to be a lot more crushing and grinding with herbivores than there are with carnivores. Once food is chewed and digestive enzymes begin to work on starch, the next thing that needs to happen is that food needs to move from the mouth to the pharynx. So let me explain sort of the architecture that we're talking about here. So the pharynx is a space that is present at the back of the mouth, it's also present at the back of the nose. And so this is sort of a combined space where the tubes from the nose and the mouth join before they either go into the respiratory system or down into the digestive system. So let's just take a look at what's here. The salivary glands are present, of course, in the mouth. They secrete saliva, and again, saliva is going to start chemical breakdown of carbohydrates. And one thing that I want to point out is if you look at the diagram, the largest salivary gland is actually sort of above and to the sides of the mouth, and tubes will lead into into the mouth from there. And so basically, food goes into the mouth. The tongue will push food to the back of the mouth, and it gets swallowed into the pharynx. Now, once food goes into the pharynx, there is, of course, a possibility that it could go down into the trachea or the windpipe. And so our adaptation for dealing with this is that there's a flap called the epiglottis that covers the trachea or windpipe as food passes by the windpipe on its way into the esophagus. And so one of the sort of strange things here is that the epiglottis doesn't move down to cover the trachea as food passes through. What actually happens is that the trachea and the larynx at the top of the trachea get jammed up into the epiglottis. So as you swallow the trachea, you can actually feel the trachea and the larynx rise to meet the epiglottis. And so if you'll put your thumb and forefinger on your throat and swallow really quickly, you'll feel the larynx sort of rise and fall as this happens. And again, the whole point here is to get food moving down the esophagus and definitely not into the trachea. Once you've moved through the esophagus by peristalsis, then food gets down to the stomach. And I wanted to say real quick that peristalsis is the main way that food moves through the esophagus. There is an assist from gravity, but the main force that moves it is actually peristalsis. And so if you've ever eaten lying down, then you know that food will move from the mouth to the stomach, whether you're upright or not. Okay, so once you get to the stomach, you're going to continue with mechanical digestion. You're going to continue with chemical digestion. And it's going to be churning that continues the mechanical digestion, and gastric juices which continue the chemical digestion. One thing that I want you to do is look at the picture to the very left here. You'll see that there are actually 3 muscle layers in the stomach. And so instead of having circular and longitudinal muscle layers, you've got those 2, but additionally you have diagonal, or what's called oblique, muscle layer. And what the 3 of these do, these 3 muscle layers allow food to be moved back and forth in much more of a 3-dimensional motion with the churning. And this is going to be able to break up food to a greater extent. As you may have noticed in the previous slide, the stomach contains internal folds that are called rugae. Now, what these folds allow the stomach to do is to expand to hold up to 4 liters of food in adults. Of course, this is going to differ from person to person depending on how much that they're used to eating and basically what size that they are. So say someone who is 4'11" is going to have a smaller stomach than Shaquille O'Neal would. But this 4 liters of food is on average in adults. And if you think about that, that's quite a bit. Picture a regular 2-liter bottle of Coke and then double it, and that's the capacity that the stomach can possibly hold. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the stomach actually carries out both chemical and mechanical processes for digestion. And so basically, it's got a really low pH, so it's very acidic, and it's going to churn to carry out mechanical digestion. And we'll see in a little bit the importance of goblet cells that produce mucus. So as food exits the stomach, it is termed chyme. At this point, I'm going to stop the video. We're about halfway through this PowerPoint, and I decided that I wanted to break this up into 2 videos rather than 1.